So previous contributions have already pointed out that the dominant discourse of economic rationality, the so-called rendementsdenken, undermines the academic values that universities should endorse. Jan Blommaert argues that this discourse is characterized by one-sidedness and close-mindedness in relation to our own history and culture. Paul Mutsaas shows that also an organization like NWO has handed itself over to this type of thinking. And furthermore, Erik van Damme makes clear that this is not only a problem of the humanities, but one that has infected the rest of academia as well. I want to contribute to this discussion from a philosophical perspective by giving a short analysis that shows how deep and difficult the problem actually is. The most important thing to realize, in my opinion, is that the utility discourse, which is like an English translation for this rendementsdenken, is not opposed to true scientific thinking. In fact, the utility argument is nothing but the practical reality of scientific rationality. The means of the utility discourse are the methods and models that have been developed at our universities. De waarheid and het rendement, the truth and the profitability, as Ramzi Nasser has put it on the new university website, are indeed two sides of the same coin. The emphasis on measurable performances, efficiency, output, rankings, etc. It is all a matter of streamlining university practice within a discourse of political decision-making that demands a rational empirical argumentation. Here, the hard facts are always superior to trust and ideals. Perhaps there is irony in the fact that even scientists are now beginning to revolt against the practical application of the rationality that they are themselves using and developing. But they are not hypocrites, because it actually threatens the existence of science itself. Also, the scientific discourse finds its continuity only in an institute that not only reproduces the specific knowledge of a scientific discipline, but also takes care of the marginal conditions that makes possible the transition of knowledge to the next generation. These marginal conditions are not part of the measurable output, but consist of a cultural development. And reproducing the highly advanced specialist knowledge of modern science requires a general intellectual development that corresponds to a significant level of civilization. The problem is that this process of Bildung is essentially a cultural praxis that cannot be objectified in terms of scientific results. As a consequence, to use the words of the young Karl Marx, the scientific discourse can, by principle, never generate enough output to fully reproduce itself. So even if one wishes to conceive of university as a company for the production of knowledge, one has to have some idea of how to find continuity in the transition of knowledge. A cultural practice that cannot be transferred in terms of scientific discourse can nonetheless be transferred through participation in the academic culture. Yet the demands of cultural participation are not compatible with those of rational empirical argumentation, because it demands an attitude of engagement and commitment, which is contrary to the one that assesses participation rationally in terms of investment and payoff. To put it in terms of the dominant discourse, engagement implies an incalculable risk. This means that the communicable knowledge, in other words, the knowledge that can be valorized, is always a limited part of the whole of knowledge that is required for the learning process. I think that for this reason, Erik van Damme's fatal analysis of the university board's policy plan and his very sympathetic plea for a bottom-up approach is extremely difficult to grasp for managers. His argument is intuitively simple. Professionals have practical know-how that is relevant for decision-making. The problem is that this argument cannot be objectified. There is no model for it. And therefore it is, as simple and modest as the argument is, a principally non-conformist argument. The objection of the board, I think completely in correspondence with the spirit of our times, will always be, of course, we believe him and we share his ideals, yet you cannot build a policy on beliefs and ideals. So let us go back to the familiarity of the numbers. But Van Dam's plea makes something very clear. It shows that a policy that tries to reproduce scientific research using exclusively the means of science alienates itself from scientific practice. Distrusting everything that resorts to faith, trust, or ideals when it comes to policy making rests on the assumption that outside of the dominant discourse there is only subjectivism. The Dutch philosopher Arthur has pointed out that this subjectivism is only the result of rejecting everything that cannot be scientifically explained by disqualifying it as an appeal to authority. To this tendency to discredit anyone because he or she appeals to a different kind of argumentation, like calling philosophers romantics because they do deviate from dominant discourse, makes subjectivism the logical reverse of the demand of rational empirical argumentation. This can be elucidated with a reference to every teacher's experience with a student who says, "It is not an argument because I don't get it." The student is absolutely right. He does not get it, and there's nothing you can do about it. This may be the most direct evidence that scientific knowledge cannot be reproduced without cultural mediation. If the culturally shared relation between student and teacher is denied, the transition of knowledge becomes impossible. Unfortunately, the reduction to subjectivism that is induced by rational empirical discourse also targets those cultural practices that cannot be counted among the output, because they cannot be objectified in models, but nonetheless function as these marginal conditions on which science itself depends for its reproduction. So the negative resistance against the discourse of economic rationality must provide a positive answer to the question, how can the university institutionalize the cultural means that make knowledge transition possible? A faculty of humanities is the age-old answer. The humanities can prevent that articulating the principal impossibility of complete objectification results in subjectivism. That is just as arrogant as visionless. By showing that the limits of knowledge have been recognized and discussed countless times in countless ways in our history and culture. Whoever poses big questions about the purpose of science, how it is possible, and how it relates to the concrete life world is not lost in subjectivity. He or she instead becomes aware of the normative framework that is presupposed by science but cannot be explained by science. These questions are, say, the spectacles through which a cultural life becomes comprehensible, without which there would be no objective reality to be modeled. So what should the humanities do? The first and foremost, and in fact only task of the humanities, is to criticize the rational empirical discourse. Because only in this way we can open up another discourse that is self-conscious about the cultural life that makes this scientific discourse possible. Humanity is a matter of critical analysis, not of opinion. Seen in this way, the fact that scholars in literary theory might prefer Kafka to Skinner, or philosophers prefer Kant to Newton, or in fact prefer connecting an idea to a name rather than a theory, is not a way of simply turning away from the objectivism of science, but testifies to a professional interest in the cultural conditions of the science company itself. Or to paraphrase Immanuel Kant, having insight in the limits of theoretical reason also creates the possibility of acquiring positive scientific knowledge.